So let's now move to our programmed content. So our first session this morning, or this afternoon, um, is Navigating Crisis in Higher Education. And so we're joined by award-winning Stephen Yorkstone and Chris Shannon. I'll just do a very brief intro for both of them, and then I'll just hand over to you to take us where you'd like to take us. So Steve is an internal consultant, coach and facilitator in higher education. He leads process improvement at Edinburgh Napier University and founded the Lean Higher Education Global Community of Practice, where he recently completed a decade as global chair. Yorkstone also serves as Secretary of the Board for the International Association of Facilitators and has some excellent facilitation YouTube videos with SpinRA. If you are interested, I highly recommend them. Supporting facilitation professionals worldwide. Frequent speaker and trainer, he combines humour, humanity, and lean thinking to help people and organisations work better together. Steve is joined by Chris Shannon. Chris has over 20 years of experience as a manager and leader in higher education, and we learnt earlier today that Chris actually started life as an accountant. So every day we're learning new things. He currently manages the University of Queensland Centre for Clinical Research, which is co-located with the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. He's the author of Collaborative Problem Solving, A Guide to Improving Your Workplace, a book which is highly recommended by, I think, everyone who's read it. He's been a member of the Lean Higher Education Network for the past decade, currently serves on the Asia Pacific Steering Committee and as Deputy Chair Governance on the Global Steering Committee. I'll hand over to you both.
Thank you. Well, I tell you, we've got to give a good presentation now, Chris. After that introduction, or there'll be trouble. But welcome. It's lovely to be here. And as we start thinking about responding to crisis in higher education 2025, what a time to be alive! Do you know, I mean, I feel like I look out and every day I'm like, oh, good grief, when I look in the newspapers or look at what's happening in the world. Is it like that for you in Australia, Chris?
It is. It's we are a little bit removed from things. We are physically a long way from other places, and sometimes although you know it's real, it's a bit like watching it on television.
Yeah, and this is something that's been that I mean is very live right now. You know, there's a lot going on in the world and a lot going on in the sector, which is why we're really glad to be able to talk about some of the things that some of the research that myself, Chris, and broader team have been doing around crisis in higher education. A little bit about us. I mean, there's not much to say after that glowing introduction, is there, Chris? That's me, and that's Global Lean for Higher Education, a book that came out of the. I feel I'm giving a book plug now. I'm not sure why, Chris. And that's your book with your book on problem solving, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah, it's me imitating the photo of Steve that I found online and provided. Global Lean, well, firstly, congratulations on your award, Stephen. Absolutely well deserved. Global Lean is a book that I was very pleased to have a chapter in. And I have to say, it actually, the process of doing that encouraged me to then write my own book. So I owe a lot to Steve.
I mean, I think it's important, as I'm a practitioner, not an academic, but it's important to be involved in the job of scholarship, you know, so we understand what it's like to be in higher education. But let's ask a question, and if you put in a chat your answer to this question for me. What's your response to crisis in one word or maybe a couple of words? If you can put that in chat for me, that would be lovely. I'd love to see what kind of rises. I mean, my response is I sort of get quite excited in the short term. I'm like, oh, let's get diving in. We can have some fun with this, which is a bit weird, perhaps. And then in the longer run, I'm like, a little bit overblown by it. What's your response to crisis in a word, Chris?
Hard to put it into a single word. I try to stay calm in a crisis, and people tell me that generally in the workplace I'm a sort of a calming presence. Depends on the crisis. Sometimes panic is the best response. You need to be galvanized into rapid response.
I don't see any responses in chat just now, but keep
Mm.
on thinking. If you can put your what's your response to crisis in one word in chat, that would be interesting. Observant. I'm not. I think that's fringe. I'm not sure. I hope that. And Karen, try to be rational, hide the panic. Opportunity.
Ooh, opportunity. That's a good one.
See the possibilities. It is an interesting thing. The T and action focus. Nice. It's interesting that we get this mix of reactions to how we get on with it, and a few words is fine. Okay, thank you. Oh, support. That's a lovely thing, especially in the contents of this circle, influence, and control. Thank you, Becky. Lovely. Right, you can read those as we go through. And what we want to talk about is some of the responding to crisis in higher education. And this is this is the kind of stuff that we'll cover. A little bit about a project that came out of COVID-19, out of the lean higher education community, and some of the research base that came with that. That leads through to thinking about what we are in higher education, how we work, reflecting on where we see potentially contemporary rapid changes that we could think of as crises. And then we want to be quite practical and think, well, actually, so this is what that means for where we are today. So hopefully that will be all right. As we go through, if there's anything else you want to add, pop something in the chat. And if it's really difficult, we will try and be like one of the Muppets and panic as we respond to your difficult questions, but we welcome them nonetheless. So, Chris, tell us a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic project.
Yeah, so this, I have actually presented on this before with Bikram in San Diego, so I won't go into a whole lot of detail about it. I guess really the point that I want to make about it is that it was a very good qualitative research project. Jitendra Singh from Minnesota University Moorhead led the project. He's very experienced in doing these. We recruited participants from 19 different universities around the world, and then Jitendra really led us through the co-design questionnaire process. We used the Braun and Clark thematic analysis method. There was a subset of us who did that, which is like standard qualitative research. I know lots of qualitative researchers, they all know and use this model. And then we sort of wrote up the themes. And so I was excited about it for the opportunity to work with Jitendra, but also because it was part of that bringing a more robust approach to what we're doing in the network and upskilling across the network. And so you can read the statement there. We had a diagram which I didn't attempt to put into a slide. It's quite a complex diagram. When we say institutional responses, that is the way in which the university responded. So business continuity, crisis management teams, rapid increase in the flow of communication, those sorts of things. We responded, universities across the world responded on a number of different levels. Teaching continuity was kind of the headline through all of the responses we got. Because students, they spend 3 years of their life doing it. Increasingly, they travel to other places to study. Universities couldn't just say, sorry, there's no teaching for a year. We had to shift very quickly to entirely online. And that, of course, brought in all the technological limitations. I'm sure people remember the Intel chip shortage that seemed to affect every industry and how it suddenly could take months and months to get a computer. I remember even things like load testing of servers to see whether it was even possible for everybody to work online at the same time. And so the staff and student experiences were common, but they were different. They were common issues, very different experiences that were very affected by the political environments, socio-political environments people were in. And so that was probably the most compelling part of the whole thing for me as a learning experience, other than the skills I learned. Because as I said, Australia is a long way from other places and we have massive oceans all around us. And so while we had COVID, we didn't have it to anywhere near the extent that other countries did. And the feedback, the responses from various parts of Europe where they were talking about the complexity of overlays of different levels of government, or some of the responses from South America and other places where there were real just poor communities and lack of infrastructure and challenges that were really exacerbated by this. So we did the project and we wanted to do more. I really enjoyed the conversations I was having with people from different parts of the world. Jitendra and I ended up talking to Routledge, and they very kindly said, yes, you can do a book. It shifted in those discussions. It shifted from don't just talk about COVID, talk about crisis more generally. And Jitendra has got quite a lot of knowledge of this and quite a big network to draw on. So these are the people who are authors in the book. A lot of them are from the Lean Higher Education Network. And then there were a few other people who were drawn into it as well. So I think I'm handing over to you, Steve.
So one of the things that that we talk about is to try and cite this in a kind of a shared understanding of what a university is. And this is a model that I produced in 2017 in the Routledge Companion to Lean Management. And I have to drop, which of course the Shingo Research Award-winning Routledge Companion
Just
to Lean
one of your
Management.
many awards,
I
Stephen.
have to say that at every point in time, mostly because my university can't afford to put me on a black belt training course. Anyway, so this model of higher education is meant to us to think about, well, what we do as a university. And of course, universities, we're a non-homogeneous sector, but we got people within universities who deliver things for the benefit of these contexts. And broadly speaking, we've got management, governance, academics, and supporting staff. And I think I'd probably blur the lines between these boxes more now than I did in 2017. And sort of these kind of outputs. Now, different universities will have different focus on these areas. Some universities more research, some more teaching, some more research outcomes. Some, like my university, really focuses on great support for students, all this kind of stuff. And then we benefit for the kind of beneficiaries that we kind of sit around us. And so when we were thinking about the COVID-19 project and starting to think about, well, what does this mean in practice for universities? Having that model was to help us to think through how we work. But we thought we'd update it. And so we've affectionately simplified it into what we call the fried egg diagram, or perhaps maybe a stacked Venn is probably a more technical term for it. But it's breakfast time here in the UK, so let's call it the fried egg diagram. And what this does is, and to put this in context, well, what we do then is we may have those academic educators in my university training lots of student nurses. I saw some in the hospital yesterday who were out there delivering healthcare. You know, little name badge of student nurses wandering around. Chris's university, august, research-centered, out there, you know, developing those molecules which will go into that vaccine, which will then go out into that healthcare context. This is the point where Chris normally points out that he teaches nurses too, but I'm not going to let him. I'm just going to crash on. So what we did, of course, is then think, so actually, well, what does that mean in response, say, to the COVID crisis? And it kind of felt like this to us. You know, we had that crisis that emerged out there in the world, in our contexts, spreading rapidly through communities, affecting people in the way that we all experienced, which of course had a huge impact on us in higher education and required us to flex our responses, as we've talked about, and then change how we delivered into that context. And so we started thinking about this in terms of how crisis works in a higher education, that what we do is we respond, we adjust, and then we go back into our context to how we make those changes. So what I'm interested, and I think perhaps what we would say is that now maybe we've gone back a little bit, maybe we've to this, you know, we're kind of a little bit calmer post-pandemics. Life isn't quite the same. We maybe do a little bit more online, but things have gone on. So this is your second question in chat. What learning from COVID-19 did you take? As few words as you can. Answer that question in chat for me. What learning did you take from COVID-19 when you reflect back where you are today? So I think is it time for me to pass back to you, Chris?
Yes, if you like. Yes.
Because let's pick up on some of the questions that are coming up in chat before I awkwardly pass the tennis ball back to Australia. But nothing is permanent. Change should be rapid. We can make decisions quickly. I love that point about dealing with no control. I go back to the circles of control and influence that we talked about at the start of the thing, how we can adapt. And there's nothing like a burning platform to facilitate change. Yeah, in Norwegian, they say "da brennpadas," which means the outhouse is on fire. You know what I mean? You've got there's nothing worse than that. So people are more adaptable than they think. So what's clear is that we learned a lot from our experiences in COVID-19. We would expect this as higher education practitioners. But in that book chapter, we thought, well, we can't ignore the fact that it's a little bit 2025 out there. You know, there's a lot happening in the world. So we felt that we would then need to look at what was happening in a more contemporary context, because now, who would have thought it? It's now 5 years since the pandemic, and we need to be talking to things more rapidly right now. And thank you for those comments in chat. That's what I'm supposed to pass to you, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah, it is, but I would have. Steve is brilliant off the cuff, and I am not. But we will be fine. Yeah, I really like Steve's model and the chapter in his Shingo Award-winning book. I thought it was really good, and I was very excited to actually have the opportunity to update it and to look at, can we make it more dynamic, and really to test it. So we looked at, well, what does it mean when we look at COVID-19 through the lens of this model? And then we, as Steve said, it is, time has passed and there's lots of going on in the world. So we asked people, what's going on? What crises do you have today? What do you think that we should be thinking about? And overwhelmingly, I guess the response that we got back was, hey, what's happening in America is a crisis. And we don't, we're not being judgmental in saying that. There's multiple definitions of crisis. One is danger, impending danger, but also a moment of pivotal change or a moment of sort of great significance. And so we'll talk through that. And I have to say, even people from other countries, when we were talking to them about, well, what's going on, what are you kind of most thinking about? What's happening in America was top of mind for a lot of them as well. So we talked to lots of people in the US. We talked to people in private universities, in the public systems, west, east, north, south, red states, blue states. We deliberately were politically agnostic in what we were asking, and we were very open in our questions. And what we present in here is sort of the feedback that we've got. And like interesting, I guess, to look at this in terms of what is the impact of a political crisis, and does this model adequately describe that without voicing your own opinion on, on whatever that political crisis might be. And so there is, I think we might be on to the next slide now. There it is. What do you call this? The worm?
I mean, the centipede, the centipede of chaos.
The centipede of chaos has arrived. So when we looked at, well, okay, COVID, we would say it's an external thing that happened. It's like a natural disaster. It's sort of out there in the context or in the environment, and you respond to it. Political crisis of any sort, we felt actually touches all of the different components, the different levels of the fried egg model, the nested model. So the people in higher education, any university is going to have thousands of people. They're going to have lots of different political views, and really the feedback that we received was that politics is quite personal, and people were describing intra-role conflict where their own views might conflict with what the organisation might be expecting them to do. They were describing the ambiguity of working in a team or a department or whatever, where you don't actually know what everybody else's politics is, and so you don't know quite how they feel about what's going on. It makes it very hard to even form an organisational response when you can't sort of identify a common external thing to talk about. It becomes much more complex. For delivery of teaching and research, I guess what really struck me from the responses was that during COVID, we had to change the mode of delivery. Everything went online. The feedback from colleagues in the US is very much that it is the content of the curriculum rather than the mode of delivery that is being tested here, and that there is a push, say, call it the woke agenda or whatever terminology you want to use. There are people in universities who feel real pressure to change what they are teaching students, and in some cases saying that even the funding of research is being used as a kind of a lever over the future content of teaching. And of course, delivery of research has become much more complex, not just in the US, in other countries. In my own centre, actually, there are people who have been funded by USAID or by the National Institute for Health. And even we, sitting in Brisbane, have had to have conversations about, well, what happens if that funding really gets turned off? What do we do? We've got people on contracts, and so there's all sorts of things going on. And of course, the context changes dramatically. And what people have described about the context really is the volume and the significance of the decisions being taken and the magnitude of change all being experienced at once is really what's been most complex. And so when we bring in the 4 points we had before, the external and the internal all seem to be mixed. In terms of an institutional response, like what would the university do to flex a response? I guess the messages that we've received are really that people don't feel that there is yet a coherent response. And so even though the current administration has been in for, 9 months, 10 months, there is still a sense of overwhelm and struggling and being yet to even start to respond in a coherent way. And so what the future looks like, what the context looks like, I think everyone believes it'll be different, but quite what it will look like, nobody can really say. And therefore, even spotting the opportunities as opposed to the challenges is quite difficult because you don't know. I think in one of the earlier sessions, people were talking about stability, and I think that's a good word. It's a unstable and still evolving situation, which makes it much more challenging to respond to. And so USA Today, I guess this is the synthesis of the messages that we've been received. And I suppose the other big differentiator between this and COVID is that there's a real sense of, obviously all these changes are being driven by government, and so there's a series of choices and decisions that are being made, presumably in the belief that things will be better as a result of them, things will be different and things will be better. And so some people, some of the responses are that the turmoil that you go through now will lead to something better. Other people are saying, well, I really don't know if it will or not.
So that kind of, I think, is an important learning. It isn't a universal, this is going to be horrendous. But what I was surprised by, how I was expecting my perspective of what was happening is very different from the kind of the research that we undertook. We did see where the kind of the academic colleagues that we spoke to felt a little bit more stable about it. That was perhaps because they were more later career folks that we were interviewing, and had been through more turbulence. And what was interesting, there was also that sense, and I think we saw this in some of your comments in chat earlier, about the sense of opportunity that there is in this crisis. That yes, there is a bit of a reset happening here. There's also opportunities for how we do that. And this is a situation that continues to change. I know the response to the compact that the US government has put out, I understand it's not something I'm close to, but I was talking to a colleague yesterday about that and how that's rolling out, and American colleagues will have thoughts about that, I'm sure. If I return to the where we started at, though, I want to kind of start thinking about, well, what does this mean in practice, right? Because we're here as practitioners. What does this mean for actually what we do? And we described it like this, but then when I think about what my lived experience was in COVID, it felt a little bit more like that when I was in COVID, because I couldn't see past it. Now looking back in from 5 years, it does feel a little bit more like it was from that external thing. But at the time, it was that sense of overwhelm, those reflecting very much a lot of the comments in the first question that I asked in chat. We then, of course, our caterpillar emerges, but I'm reflecting on our first keynote, who I understand talked about the kind of the poly crisis in higher education today. And it feels a little bit like, well, that's just one thing. There's a lot else going on as well. Do you like my little caterpillars flying in there, Kate? I did that just for you. How actually there's a lot going on. We've got the continuing demographic changes of our students. We've got the rise of advanced technology, how that's going to affect what we do, and the impact. I know with my colleagues who are just literally how we mark stuff has to be done differently. Then we've got the underlying climate crisis, which we've not been talking a lot about, but is going to change stuff. We're increasingly seeing weather change effects around the world. So again, maybe I feel like this again. Maybe that's the experience of being in 2025. But I go back to reflecting where I started on that if it feels like that right now, then perhaps we've got an opportunity to grow as a context around that. And that as a sector, we've got the ability to make the most of that opportunity and flex and change the way that we work around that context. And I hope that, and this is a position of hope, over time we will then end up with that back again. That we will look back on this and maybe it will have changed how we deliver our teaching and research. There is a real sense that this will change how we talk to our contexts. But I suspect, fingers crossed, we'll end up like this again as a sector that's learnt through this experience. And we've been through a few pandemics in the lifetime of some of the universities on this call already, looking at you, Linda Spinks. So what I would say is, let's look at what the practical advice is for us as universities before we go to questions, because we've got until about past for questions. Am I right, Melissa? Yeah. So I think we should accept this is uncharted territory. You know, maybe the realization of that is important. Just to pause and go, well, actually, if we're doing the PDCA or the DMAIC, well, actually, part of that baseline is, as my wise policy advisor at my university would say, the horizon of uncertainty is closer now than it ever has been before. Given that we know that, that means we need to plan differently in what we do now. And actually, I think that takes us back to what we're all good at, that PDCA approach, that lean thing. So shortening that cycle time of experiments, managing down the scope of change is an appropriate response to a close horizon of uncertainty. And we're really good at that. So we should be confident as lean practitioners we have a lot to offer our institutions. And looking at the learning that a lot of you put in chat to our second question, I can see that we do that. There is something about that reset of our contexts and how we explain the value of universities to the world. And it's maybe easier for universities which have a badge on a nurse in a hospital. But that doesn't mean it's no less important to be researching the molecule, the technology, the fine art, all the glorious things that our universities do. We really need to reflect on how we work with our contexts. What's good is that we know how to work to approach wicked problems. You know, we break things down, we approach them in lots of ways, and we apply that learning. And one of the challenges, and I'd like us to have a little bit of a discussion about that, if that's okay, is what it means to how we show respect for people in a politically charged context. You'll have noticed Chris and I have been non-judgmental. We've tried to say this is what people say to us, and this is how it feels for people in those contexts. I'm not sure there's a simple answer to how to show respect for people, but it does strike me that that's so important as we navigate this going forward. And my as we look back on a long-lived sector, I would say looking after our libraries, both metaphorically and literally, is important, because that's what allows us the capacity to rebuild, adjust, or learn from that previous experience. So we started by talking about how Chris, Shannon, and I have contributed to books. I do this because a colleague challenged me at a Lean HE conference, and he said, you need to write this stuff down. You need to tell your story. And these videos being recorded on YouTube is one way that we do that. And I would encourage you all as practitioners to make that record, partly because it's good to be involved with the scholarly project. It teaches us to be a part of higher education, but also it enables colleagues to learn, us to grow, and to go next. So I guess my practical thoughts are, let's keep perspective, let's keep intentionality about PDCA, let's reflect on what we see as data, and use us as a community to support with that. But we're in a situation so uncharted, we might be missing something. What else is there that's going on? We'd love to see what your thoughts are in chat, so please put them in there. And I think maybe as we go into seeing what any questions and answers might be, it might be interesting to explore a little bit, practically speaking, how we display that respect for people in this kind of environment. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, yes, I agree. I was thinking about Rufus's keynote presentation, and I may have written this down slightly incorrectly, but he was talking about what he called simplifying back to the essence. And the quote that I wrote down was, people in clearings having conversations and creating meaning. And he had like a picture of like a forest glade and said, well, this is where teaching started. It was people gathering in a place and talking. That really resonated with me. And I actually, because I knew, the content of this presentation, I was thinking about this conclusion and particularly Steve's look after our libraries. And I thought, well, actually, this is something that we're pretty good at. We're good at being kind to each other. We're good at helping each other. And we're good at going back to our fundamental skills, like the presentation from Bikram and Kim this morning, where she was talking about carrying your purse or your handbag and what have you got in it. And you want it to be light so you can carry it around, but you want it to be meaningful. And I think this is actually something that we can do really well. But as Steve said, we need to be intentional.
And I think intentional in relation to the purpose of our institutions and really understanding why we're here and sticking true to that, because what we do is important. For me, that's one of the ways that we can express respect for people in this context, is knowing that the purpose of our institutions are fundamental to that respect for people. And I say people generally, because pretty much universally, and whether that is through computer science or philosophy, our institutions are about that broader human project, and reminding ourselves of that, of why we're here, I think can help build a shared conversation, because that's what brings people to our organizations. There's no questions in chat, Melissa, there's no comments, so Chris and I will keep burbling, but I'll invite you to come in and help us with that. But I mean, it strikes me that there is a lot of learning that we have from the COVID pandemic that we can apply in this context that we see in the chat there.
So, does anyone have any questions they would like to ask? Bikram, easy.
I'm so terrible at typing what's in my head. I'm also terrible at actually saying it out loud. It really makes sense, but we have a bunch of very astute people here, so I'm going to lean on that. I've been reading something, in fact, as a consequence of working on this book that we're all contributing to, that you mentioned, Steve and Chris. I've been reading, I think it's Charles Perrow's work called Normal Accidents. Right? And he talks about how we underestimate the complexity and therefore the probability of some of these things not going to plan because of the complexity of systems that are interacting rather than simply elements that are interacting. In that context, there are a couple of things you mentioned that led me to, I guess, perhaps two provocations. I'm really interested in your thoughts on that. One was you mentioned, well, I guess tailing off from the complexity, you were talking about, an understanding of how to address complex problems. And I wonder how that is affected by, Chris, you were talking about going back to simple things or the simpler elements that at least to me, it feels like there's a fundamental change occurring in how we value things. Right? And us questioning how we value things. How do you see how that affects us as a sector and as the people who are trying to create improvement within it, or at least enable improvement within it? The other sort of provocation that I had, and that was a comment I think you made almost in passing about finding that academic responses to your questions generally reflected that they were more comfortable. We had a conversation about something along these lines a little earlier in the day, a couple of days, whatever it was. But I wonder if some of that has to do with academics often associating change in their jobs with curriculum change, which is very normal and very comfortable, but not necessarily with pedagogical change, which is not nearly as normal and has been quite challenging. So those two thoughts.
Are you right if I pick up on those, Chris, and then you can come in with any additions?
Sure.
So in reverse order, I think I would say more comfortable, not comfortable. And I think probably, and if I reflect on those interviews, it's probably relating to the academic ability to sort of objectify stuff and take more of a philosophical perspective, but also because they're probably in their day-to-day work a little bit further away from the rapid policy change that colleagues were seeing in more professional services zone. So when we were talking to colleagues working in a sort of a head office type function in an institution, they would see policy changes coming out at a fast pace, rapidly. And what they would be doing is applying some of the learning, as we talked about in chat, to think about communicating that very intentionally at an appropriate tact time, not just communicating when it comes in. But the process of being involved with that, I think, is quite, I suppose I could say, anxiety provoking. Whereas academic colleagues, they're used to thinking on a longer term and maybe a step beyond that. But I would say we're more comfortable. I wouldn't say we're comfortable there. When it comes to questioning value, I think it's, when I think about the role of advanced technology and how that's changing, the joke is that the student submits the coursework in AI, which the academic marks by AI. AI says it's full of plagiarism, and then the academic conduct officer sends a letter written by AI to the student who appeals it using AI with their lawyers. Where is the value add in this thing? But we've been talking about authentic teaching for a long time. This isn't new. And a lot of our academic colleagues are already engaging with how to do the business of talking to students authentically. I'm going to add a little bit before I pass to Chris, which is there's a colleague of mine who works in our law school. Here in the UK, there are legal changes around some the way that human rights are interpreted, and these debates have become very polarized. And his plan is to arrange walks through the field, as you talk about that book, Bikram, The Normal Accidents, to actually literally go on a walk side by side with people who have a very different view from you to see if we can broker understanding. He invited me to go on one of those walks, and I was a little bit scared. I was like, I don't know if I could. How could I do that? So I'm applying that reflection on action in my own process in how I relate to colleagues individually. Because for me, in that complicated situation, focusing on those sphere of control, and thank you for that comment in chat, that's all I can do. And doing that practically helps. Sorry, I've gone on for a bit. Chris?
But I always enjoy listening to Steve. So if I pick up on the first question about how we value things. So in the model that Steve had from 2017, we say people in higher education deliver teaching and research to support their context. And we actually talked about this in preparing this presentation. So to support their context implies broad alignment and support of what's happening in society, how the institution is placed within the community. And we wondered whether in a changed context, if there was a lot of misalignment of, say, institutional versus governmental or prevailing society views, whether they would be delivering teaching and research in their context rather than to support their context. And, we were then talking about how universities actually used to be hotbeds of radicalism and protest, and it's kind of where lots of social change came from. So I'm not sure if that's what you meant, Bikram, but if it is, it's certainly something that we've been thinking about.
Well, you guys are right on time. You managed to wrap up the answer to that question really quickly, Chris. There's a couple of comments that have come in through the chat. Graham has made some really good points there around Toshin Canry baselining with SWOT, and then that tactical review of performance measures. Some thank yous for the presentation. I'm now sitting here reflecting on that question that you've posed around how do we demonstrate respect for people when we have such differing views. And I suppose my very simplistic response is we demonstrate that respect by providing time and space for those differing views to exist. Maybe that's all we can do at the moment. I'm not sure. I think I'm going to marinate on that question. That's good.
I think about how it's respect for people, not respect for individuals. That's an interesting thing. What do we mean? What's the breadth of respect for people? Is it respect for people in the here and now, or respect for everybody? Respect for the people to come in the future? Maybe respect for the people in the past, thinking of where we might be in the world. Anyway, thank you.
So thought-provoking as always, you two. Now my mind's going, is it respect for the best interests of people? Is like, okay, I need to stop thinking now, don't I? That's maybe you could explore that in your next book. Anyway, thank you so much, Steve and Chris, for that session. I think it's been really useful to look at how you've taken that model from 2017 and how you've adapted it to play back where we are now. What I'd love to see is how that evolves over time, and if you can make any predictions about what is the model going to look like in 5 years' time. Where is that going to take us? So many thoughts. I need to slow my mind down. Can everyone just join with me in big thank you to both Steve and Chris for that session. I think you've given us all a lot to think about. Thank you. Thank you for sharing some time with us today.